So we're picking up today sort of in the middle of this slide with the Revolution of 1830 in France. And we were looking at the reforms and revolutions that brought liberal changes in Europe prior to 1848. And so we're starting with this one today. Louis XVIII, who was restored to the throne after Napoleon fell from power in 1814, and this, again, the brother of Louis XVI, he set up a constitutional charter of 1814, which was basically a liberal constitution that fully protected the economic and social gains of the middle class and the peasantry in the French Revolution. It also permitted great intellectual and artistic freedom and created a parliament with upper and lower houses. In reality, though, this charter was anything but democratic because it only allowed about 100,000 of the wealthiest males to vote out of a total population of 30 million. So it was hardly representative of the population at large. Nevertheless, the notable people who did vote came from a variety of backgrounds. Some of them were wealthy businessmen, some of them just became wealthy because of war, some of them were ex-revolutionaries or large landowners, some came from the middle class, some were just successful professionals, some were just old aristocracy or old money. But unfortunately for France, Louis' successor, Charles X, wanted to reestablish the old order in France. He was blocked by the opposition of the deputies. So in 1830, he turned to the military in an attempt to rally French nationalism and gain popular support. And so in order to make himself popular so that he could overturn these liberal reforms, he responded in June 1830 to a long-standing dispute with Muslim Algeria. And so he sent a French force of 37,000 men across the Mediterranean and took the Algerian capital of Algiers in just 3 weeks. And so in 1831, tribes in the interior of Algeria revolted and waged a terrible war until 1847, 16 years later, when French armies finally subdued the country and expropriated large tracts of Muslim land. So Charles X was emboldened by this news from Algeria, and he repudiated the constitutional charter in July 1830, stripping much of the middle class of its voting rights and censoring the press. And so after 3 days of insurrection in the capital, the government collapsed and Charles fled. And so the upper middle class seated Charles' cousin on the throne, Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans. And Louis Philippe accepted the constitutional charter of 1814 and just admitted that he was merely the king of the French people. And so the situation in France remained fundamentally unchanged. However, there had been a change in dynasty to protect the status quo for the upper middle class. And social reformers for the poor of Paris were bitterly disappointed because it was pretty much the middle class who was protected and not the poor. So in this slide, we're looking at the revolutions of 1848. The ones in the last slide were, of course, prior to 1848, but there were multiple revolutions that took place in that year. So we're looking at France again, a democratic republic in France. The political and the social response to the economic crisis of the 1840s was unrest and protest. And there were these pre-revolutionary outbreaks all across Europe. And so by the late 1840s, revolution in Europe was almost universally expected. Unfortunately, it took revolution in Paris once again to turn these expectations into realities. Even though Louis Philippe had replaced a king who had been forced to abdicate, people were still unhappy with him because they believed that he favored the middle classes. So he was called a bourgeois monarchy. Remember, bourgeoisie is the term for middle class. And so the government refused to consider electoral reform. Remember, only a very small portion of men can vote. And eventually this turned into popular revolt in Paris on February 22nd, 1848. And in this rebellion, workers and students armed with guns dug in behind barricades and demanded a new government. And when Louis Philippe refused to order a full-scale attack by the regular army, the revolutionaries proclaimed a provisional republic headed by a 10-man executive committee and immediately drafted a constitution for France's second republic. This time, though, they wanted a truly democratic republic and so gave the right to vote to every adult male and also freeing all slaves in the French colonies. They also abolished the death penalty and while they were at it, established a 10-hour workday in Paris. And so profound differences within the revolutionary coalition in Paris sort of reached a head in 1848 in the face of rising unemployment and worsening depression. Moderate liberal Republicans who had conceded to popular forces on the issue of universal mandated suffrage were willing to provide temporary relief, and that's it, really, just temporary relief. They were opposed to any further radical social measures. On the other hand, radical Republicans and artisans hated the unrestrained competition of cutthroat capitalism, and they fought for a combination of strong craft unions and worker-owned businesses. So the resulting compromise set up these national workshops, which were really soon to become nothing than a vast program of pick and shovel public works that really satisfied no one. So as the economic crisis worsened, the number enrolled in these workshops went from 10,000 in March to 120,000 in June, and then another 80,000 trying to join unsuccessfully. And so Alexis de Tocqueville, who was one of the newly elected members of this constituent assembly, made the observation that the socialist movement in Paris brought about fierce hostility of France's peasants, who owned land even, and the middle and upper class. And so really this clash of ideologies of liberal capitalism and socialism became a clash of classes and arms after the election. And so artisans and unskilled workers who feared that their socialist hopes were about to be dashed to pieces invaded the Constituent Assembly on May 15th and tried to proclaim a new revolutionary state. And so on top of this, the workshops continued to grow more radical. They continue to be so full, servicing more people or holding more people than they really safely could. And the fearful but powerful property classes in the assembly finally just dissolved the national workshops in Paris, giving workers the choice of joining the army or going out to the provinces to work in workshops there. So the result of this was a spontaneous and violent uprising. So you have barricades springing up in the streets of Paris, and a terrible class war began. And after what's been called the 3 June days of street fighting and the death or injury of more than 10,000 people, the Republican Army under General Louis Cavaignac stood triumphant in a sea of working class blood and hatred. So in a place of generous democratic republic, the Constituent Assembly completed a constitution featuring a strong executive. And an election was held in December of 1848, and the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Napoleon, was elected, and he fulfilled the desire of the propertied classes for order at any cost and produce an all too common semi-authoritarian regime. Okay, so the revolution in Austria. The revolution in the Austrian Empire began in Hungary in 1848, our key year, where nationalistic Hungarians gathered to demand national autonomy, full civil liberties, and universal suffrage. And when the monarchy in Vienna hesitated, Viennese students and workers went out to the streets, and peasant disorders broke out in other parts of the empire. And so the Habsburg Emperor, Ferdinand I, finally gave in and promised reforms and a liberal constitution. Well, what about our favorite Clemens von Metternich, the very conservative Austrian prime minister? Well, he fled in disguise toward London and ultimately resigned his post. But the coalition of revolutionaries was not stable. And once the monarchy abolished serfdom, the newly free peasants lost interest in the political and social questions that were agitating in the cities. Meanwhile, the coalition of urban revolutionaries broke down along class lines over the issue of socialist workshops and universal voting rights for men, of course. So in March of 1848, the Hungarian revolutionary leaders pushed through this extremely liberal, almost democratic constitution. But they also wanted to transform Hungary's multitude of people into a unified and a centralized Hungarian nation. And to the minority groups that formed half of the population, like the Croats, the Serbs, the Romanians, unification was unacceptable, as each group felt entitled to their own autonomy and their own cultural independence. So finally, the conservative aristocratic forces regained their nerve under the rallying call of the Archduchess Sophia, who was Ferdinand's sister-in-law, who insisted that Ferdinand abdicate in favor of her son, Francis Joseph. And so on June 17th, the army bombarded Prague and pretty savagely crushed a working class revolt. And by the end of October, the regular Austrian army attacked the student and working class radicals who were barricaded in Vienna. They retook the city, but at the cost of more than 4,000 casualties. So Ferdinand gave in, and Francis Joseph was crowned the Emperor of Austria. And when that happened, Nicholas I of Russia sent 130,000 Russian troops into Hungary to help subdue the country after bitter fighting. And for a number of years, the Habsburgs ruled Hungary as like a conquered territory. All right, so that brings us to Prussia and the Frankfurt Assembly. When the artisans and factory workers in Berlin temporarily joined with the middle-class liberals in March of 1848, fighting against the Prussian monarchy, the autocratic yet compassionate Frederick William IV just caved in. And on March 21st, he promised to grant Prussia a liberal constitution and to merge Prussia into a new national German state. When the workers issued a series of democratic and pretty socialist demands that even troubled their middle-class allies, a conservative clique gathered together around the king to urge a counter-revolution. And so in May, a National Assembly convened in Frankfurt to write a German federal constitution. But the members of the assembly were temporarily distracted by Denmark's claims on some of the German provinces, which were inhabited primarily by Germans. And so the National Assembly called on the Prussian army to respond, and Prussia wound up in a war with Denmark in the middle of this revolution and counter-revolution. So in March of 1849, the National Assembly came back to their task and finally completed its draft of a liberal constitution. And they elected Frederick William to be the Prussian emperor of the new German national state. And so Frederick William, of course, reasserted his royal authority, disbanded the Prussian Constituent Assembly, and granted his subjects a limited, essentially conservative constitution. So he kind of single-handedly overturned this movement. When Frederick William, who really wanted to be emperor but only on his authoritarian terms, tried to get the small monarchs of Germany to elect him emperor, Austria balked. They thought it was ridiculous. And supported by Russia, Austria forced Prussia to renounce all of its schemes of unification in 1850, and the German Confederation was reestablished. And so the attempts to unite the Germans, first in a liberal national state and then in a conservative Prussian empire, had pretty much completely failed. And so we'll leave off there today, and this will be our last video for chapter 23.